April the 26th, 1927. The morning after Newcastle Brown Ale launched, police begged the brewery to lower the strength. Prison cells were full. The beer had gone on sale at 6.25% ABV, stronger than anything working men were used to, and at 9 shillings for a dozen bottles, cost more than most could afford. Colonel Jim Porter thought he'd created a failure. He'd been trying to recreate Bass Ale and made something completely different instead. 78 years later, they stopped brewing it in Newcastle. This is the story of a beer that defined a city, then lost it. Subscribe to see how it happened. Colonel Porter's accidental masterpiece. Lieutenant Colonel James Herbert Porter arrived at Newcastle Breweries in 1924 with a brief that seemed straightforward enough. Create a premium bottled ale that could rival the pale ales coming out of Burton-upon-Trent. Porter was a third-generation brewer from Burton himself, a veteran of the North Staffordshire Regiment who'd earned his DSO with Bar during the First World War before trading battlefields for brewhouses. Working alongside chemist Archie Jones, Porter spent 3 years experimenting with malts, hops, and brewing techniques, keeping the entire development process secret so rivals couldn't copy what they were doing. The recipe changed so many times during those 3 years that competitors couldn't have tracked it even if they'd tried. When Porter finally completed the beer in April 1927, he considered it a complete failure. He'd been attempting to recreate Bass Ale and had produced something that tasted nothing like it. The beer launched anyway at an original gravity of 1060 degrees and 6.25% ABV, selling for 9 shillings per dozen pint bottles when most brown ales cost half that. The morning after it went on sale, Newcastle police contacted the brewery with an urgent request: lower the strength. The prison cells were packed with men who'd underestimated how strong the new beer was, and the police didn't have room for any more. Porter's failure swept the gold medals at the 1928 International Brewery Awards. 30 years later, he became managing director of Newcastle Breweries and was awarded a CBE. He died in Newcastle in 1973, having accidentally created one of Britain's most successful beers while trying to copy someone else's. Have you ever accidentally created something better than what you were aiming for? The Blue Star. 1928 brought the logo that would define Newcastle Brown Ale for the next century. The 5-pointed Blue Star appeared on bottles exactly 1 year after the beer launched and the same year the Tyne Bridge opened, creating a visual connection between beer and city that became inseparable from the brand. Each point of the star represented one of the 5 breweries that had merged in 1890 to form Newcastle Breweries Limited: John Barris and Company, Carr Brothers and Carr, J.J. Allison, W.H. Allison, and Swinburne and Company. The logo evolved to include a silhouette of Newcastle's skyline with the Tyne Bridge arching across it, and those gold medals from the 1928 International Brewery Awards found permanent places on the label. The clear glass bottle was an unusual choice. Most brewers used brown or green glass to protect beer from light that could skunk it, but the clear glass let you see the translucent amber-brown colour, and that became part of the appeal. Working man's beer. Shipyards along the Tyne, coal mines stretching into Northumberland, armaments factories and steel forging plants that kept the North East's economy running, Newcastle Brown Ale was the beer of the industries that defined the region. Served in half-pint schooner glasses that workers topped up slowly from the bottle to keep it at the right temperature, Newkie Brown spread beyond Newcastle to become a national symbol of working-class culture, though Geordies themselves never called it that, preferring Broon or Dog instead. The 1960 merger between Newcastle Breweries and Scottish Brewers created Scottish and Newcastle and gave the beer national distribution for the first time. Sales climbed through the decade and hit their peak in the early 1970s when shipyards still employed thousands, and the mines hadn't closed yet. The beer had been reformulated by then to 4.7% ABV from the original 6.25%, making it sessionable enough for a Friday night at the pub without landing you in the cells the police had worried about back in 1927. The taste set it apart from other brown ales, lighter in colour, translucent rather than opaque, with caramel and toffee notes balanced by hints of banana and dried fruit that came from the carefully controlled fermentation. You rarely saw it on draft. Newcastle Brown Ale meant a clear glass bottle with a blue star on the label, and that's how people wanted it. The student cult. The late 1980s brought an unexpected revival from an unexpected source. Student unions across Britain started stocking Newcastle Brown Ale heavily, and university students who had no connection to shipbuilding or coal mining embraced it as their beer, creating a cultural bridge between the working-class roots and middle-class aspirations that let the beer survive even as the industries that had defined it disappeared. By the late 1990s, it was the most widely distributed alcoholic product in the UK, selling in every pub and off-licence from Cornwall to the Highlands. The shipyards were closing by then, the mines had shut, the steelworks were gone, but the beer's working-class image persisted alongside this new identity as a student favourite. That dual appeal, authentic heritage with contemporary relevance, kept Newcastle Brown Ale alive when the economic context that had created it vanished. The beer's about to leave Newcastle for the first time in 78 years. Subscribe to see what happened next. America discovers Newcastle. In Britain, Newcastle Brown Ale meant shipyards and working men and Friday nights at the club. In America, it meant something else entirely. The export market positioned it as a trendy premium import, urban and sophisticated, the kind of beer you drank when you wanted something with more character than Budweiser, but weren't ready to commit to the craft beer movement that was just beginning to gather momentum. The US became the crucial market by the 2000s. College students and young professionals discovered it as a gateway beer, something that introduced them to flavour beyond the mainstream lagers they'd grown up drinking. By 2007, more than 7.5 million cases were shipping to America annually, and by 2010 that had grown to 640,000 hectolitres. More than half of everything Newcastle breweries produced was crossing the Atlantic to places where nobody had heard of the Tyne, Swan Hunter or Geordie working-class culture. The American marketing bore no resemblance to the UK campaigns. No shipyards, no heavy industry, no working men in flat caps. Instead, urban sophistication, self-aware irony, the kind of advertising that winked at you while it sold you beer. One advert featured old footage of miners and acknowledged exactly what it was doing. Nothing sells beer like old footage of people who had it way worse than you do. The YouTube description added, "This is not just a commercial to sell beer. It's a celebration of our rich heritage shown to sell beer." Americans drinking Newcastle Brown Ale in Brooklyn bars had no idea it was supposed to represent anything beyond being a decent imported beer in a clear bottle with a blue star. The cultural context had evaporated somewhere over the Atlantic, leaving just the taste and the logo. Leaving Newcastle, April the 22nd, 2004. Scottish and Newcastle announced the Tyne Brewery would close despite having spent £16.6 million on a new bottling plant there just 5 years earlier. Production would consolidate at the Federation Brewery in Dunston, just across the River Tyne in Gateshead, following their £7.2 million purchase of the site. May 2005 saw the last production run at the Tyne Brewery, where Newcastle Brown Ale had been brewed since 1927. Pre-production trials at Dunston ensured the taste wouldn't change after the move, and technically, the beer was still being made in the Newcastle area, even if it wasn't actually in Newcastle anymore. The Tyne Brewery site sold to a consortium of Newcastle University, Newcastle City Council, and the regional development agency One North East as part of the Newcastle Science City project. March 8, 2007. Sir Bobby Robson triggered the controlled demolition of the old bottling plant that had overlooked St James's Park, and the building that had produced millions of bottles of Newcastle Brown Ale came down in clouds of dust and rubble. Bottling had already moved to John Smith's brewery in Tadcaster, North Yorkshire, 250 miles south of Newcastle. 2010 brought the final severance. Scottish and Newcastle closed the Dunston Brewery and moved all Newcastle Brown Ale production to Tadcaster permanently. The company cited falling beer markets and overcapacity across their plants. Dunston had been operating at just 60% capacity. The irony went unmentioned. Newcastle Brown Ale sales had never been higher. 2000. Market research suggested ale sounded old-fashioned and alienated the youth market. The UK label dropped the word, becoming just Newcastle Brown in an attempt to modernise the brand and boost sales among younger drinkers. 2004. Newcastle Brown Ale returned to the label with no announcement or fanfare. The name change hadn't helped sales. If anything, it had confused people who'd been drinking Newcastle Brown for decades and didn't see why it needed a new name. 2015 brought a change that made more sense. Heineken removed the caramel colouring that had darkened the beer since 1927, using roasted malt instead to achieve the same amber-brown hue. Health-conscious consumers appreciated it, and the taste remained unchanged. Brewed everywhere except Newcastle. Heineken bought Scottish and Newcastle in 2008 alongside Carlsberg, splitting the assets between them. Production stayed at Tadcaster through the takeover, but 2017 saw Heineken add brewing at their Zoeterwoude facility in the Netherlands to serve European and export markets more efficiently. 2019 marked another shift. Lagunitas Brewing Company, a Heineken subsidiary, started producing Newcastle Brown Ale in Petaluma, California and Chicago, Illinois for the American and Canadian markets. The recipe changed, more assertively hopped to suit American craft beer palates, and American drinkers who'd loved the original hated the new version. The Lagunitas Chicago Brewery closed in 2024, and 2025 brought Newcastle Brown Ale back to its original UK recipe for the American market. The beer now brews at Tadcaster and ships across the Atlantic again, coming full circle except for one detail. It's still not brewed anywhere near Newcastle. The beer still sells 100 million bottles annually in the UK and exports to more than 40 countries, but it hasn't been brewed in the Northeast since 2010. The protected geographical indication awarded in 1996, guaranteeing it could only be produced in Newcastle upon Tyne, disappeared when the EU removed the protection after production moved. The beer travelled the world carrying Newcastle's name, while Newcastle itself was 250 miles behind. Can a Newcastle beer still be a Newcastle beer if it's not brewed in Newcastle? What's left? Newcastle Science City stands where the Tyne Brewery once produced millions of bottles. The buildings flattened in 2007 to make room for research facilities and university buildings. The Federation Brewery in Dunston closed in 2010 and was demolished shortly after. No Newcastle Brown Ale has been brewed in the Northeast for 15 years. The beer sponsored Newcastle United between 1995 and 2000, during the era when Kevin Keegan's team challenged for the Premier League title and reached Wembley 4 times. That association cemented the connection between beer and city even as production was preparing to leave, creating a cultural link that persisted beyond geography. Geordies still consider it theirs. The blue star still shows the Tyne Bridge arching across Newcastle's skyline. The label still says Newcastle Brown Ale, not Tadcaster Brown Ale, and Heineken hasn't suggested changing it. The beer exists as a symbol of Geordie identity that happens to be divorced from the place that gave it that identity, manufactured elsewhere but carrying the name like a passport from a country that doesn't exist anymore. Newcastle Brown Ale survived longer than the shipyards that built the city, longer than the coal mines that employed thousands, longer than the heavy industries that made the Northeast an economic powerhouse. Then it survived the loss of those industries by becoming something else to different people in different places. What it didn't survive was staying in Newcastle. The last bottle rolled off the Tyne Brewery production line in May 2005, and whatever connection existed between the beer and the city turned into something preserved in logos and marketing rather than geography and production. That's the rise and fall of Newcastle Brown Ale. Subscribe for more stories of British icons that outlived their origins. Did you drink it? Tell us in the comments.